before, just to remind you that the Jewish Bible goes by a number of different names. In Hebrew, we use the acronym Tanakh, which refers to Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah being the first 5 books, Nevi'im being the Hebrew prophets, and Ketuvim being the writings, and all of that is synonymous with what Christians refer to as the New Testament. I'm sorry, the Old Testament. Thank you. As the Old Testament, right? So those words are all, for our purposes, synonymous, but we're going to refer to the Bible when I speak of it. Okay? All right. We can talk about this for as long as we want, and we can certainly come back to it, or if there's any questions at all any time you should ask. But what I want to go to is if we allow that for our purposes, this was redacted in about, we call it about 400 BCE, that this text here is rather terse. And the question comes up very quickly, by what authority, or by whose authority, do we have a means by which to say what a text means, or to interpret it? Does that make sense? That's the question. If we understand, and the conceit is that we understand, that the Bible is been provided by God, that is to say that Moses, remember this conceit, we're going to call this Mount Sinai, that Moses atop here on Mount Sinai gets, according to the story, the 10 Commandments, and those 10 Commandments are what we call a metonym, which is to say a part that represents the whole figuratively. So an outstretched hand represents the help that God provides, or that the government provides, or when the Air Force One arrives in a country, the United States has shown up because Air Force One is a metonym for the presidency, for the country, a flag, symbols, all of these give rise to a rich symbolic logic. What? But that over and above objectifying individuals or reducing people to parts, where we describe someone only as their parts, if you asked to see pictures of my children and I showed you their faces, you'd be satisfied. Whereas if I showed you from the neck down 90% of their body, you wouldn't be satisfied, because for human beings, the face is a metonym for the person. And when we see a face, we understand that represents the whole person, right? And it doesn't work with other parts. They may be interchangeable or may reduce people to parts, and then they don't take on the human characteristics anymore. But when a part represents the whole, we have a metonymic opportunity, which is to say we have a metonym. The 10 Commandments are a metonym for symbolically the entirety of the Torah. The Torah, the scroll, which is to say the first 5 books, which we said were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, G-E-L-N-D. And if you needed a mnemonic device to remember that, you might use God's everlasting love never dies, or General Electric lights never dim, depending upon how theistic you're feeling. And that this Torah, that's the metonym for the Bible, and ultimately something larger. And that's where this question of rabbinic authority comes in. Join us. Just pull up a chair. So the question becomes, by what authority do we have the right to determine what something means? So for instance, we've spoken of this before, I believe, but you can remind those of us that weren't here. Do you remember the first commandment in Genesis? What's the first commandment that God gives to humanity? Be fruitful and multiply. That's rather terse. We've come to understand what it means because we live in a society that gives us some parameters and guardrails and some moral expectations, and our families have taught us certain things about what's expected of us. But when it says be fruitful and multiply, along comes the community and says, well, how do we make sure we do that correctly? Not how do the birds and bees conversation progress, but with whom and when and to what end? That is to say, you could understand that command to mean that human beings are commanded to males to impregnate as many women as frequently as possible, and women to carry as many babies as their bodies will allow, right? And to some extent, that still exists in the larger conversation about reproduction, about monogamy, about sexual relationships, about sexual politics, about reproductive rights, about abortion, adoption. All of these things originate in this command to be fruitful and multiply, build a family, right? And so the rabbis ask, in the same way, I thought I had done this before, in the same way as the Supreme Court had to ask, by what authority do we have to interpret the Constitution? By what authority do we have to determine what it means when it says in the Torah, be fruitful and multiply, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, that dictates food, right? What does it mean to say that you should eat and be satisfied and bless? At what point there's a command to say a blessing after you eat or after you're satisfied. So what does that mean? How much food qualifies for a satisfying meal such that it deserves a blessing? And when do you say it? And how much time can elapse between the time you finish your meal and offer your blessing of thanks? And all of these kinds of conversations grow out of this need to expand Torah into the rest of our lives. Okay? And so they come up with the idea that there was atop Mount Sinai, not a single Torah, but rather two Torahs. There's a written Torah. Today they're both written. But the written Torah meaning that which Moses received. And there's an oral Torah, which is to say, the means by which the Torah speaks to us, or the means by which we explicate meaning from the Torah, from the Bible. Now, let me say one more thing and then I'll stop and take questions. Do you know the word chutzpah? You know the Jewish word chutzpah? Do you know what it means? Can you define it?
The Rostin version.
Yeah, what's Leo Rostin say in The Joy of Yiddish? You know his definition of...
He says a man that kills his parents and throws himself on the mercy of the court because he's an orphan.
That's right. A man kills both his mother and father, and when he's hauled before the judge, he throws himself on the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. Right? But he obviously killed both his parents, right? So that's quite a claim to make that you deserve mercy thereby, because you don't have any living parents, right? So chutzpah is a kind of moxie, a kind of gall, a kind of hubris and nerve and gumption, and all of that sort of rolled in, right? The rabbis, in the same way as John Jay in the Supreme Court with Marbury versus Madison, took for themselves the right, abrogated for themselves, the Supreme Court did, the right to interpret the Constitution, because that right's not actually provided in the Constitution. But today we all understand that's the role of the Supreme Court, as troubled as we may be about who sits on the Supreme Court and whether it's politicized, whether they should sit for life, or all the conversation about the Supreme Court. But the authority that we're concerned is being vested in these 9 individuals unelected for life, is that they alone possess the authority to interpret the Constitution. And the rabbis took for themselves, we'll talk about who the rabbis are. The rabbis with a capital R take for themselves the authority to do the same thing. So just stop there for a moment. I'm going to explain the list and give you an explanation of this. All right? Okay. So then let's start here. Here's a handout I want to share with you. It'll walk us through this idea. So we'll just send this down this way. I need 15, then I'm sure we're okay. Right? There we go. You're welcome. There you are. Another. There we go. Okay. Does everyone have one?
Oh, no,
They should be coming. I think we have enough. Do we not?
yeah.
All right. I was optimistic at 15, but okay, we have extra. All right. So let's take a look at this, and we'll stop every so often. The written Torah and the oral Torah. According to Jewish tradition, 2 Torahs were received on Mount Sinai, one written and one passed down orally for generations. When most people think of Torah, they probably imagine a scroll read each week in the synagogue. But that scroll, which consists of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is only part of what Jews mean when they refer to Torah. The scroll read in the synagogue consists of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with the latter books of the prophets and the writings, 24 books in all. This is the Hebrew Bible, also known as the written Torah, or Torah shebichtav, the Torah that's written in Hebrew. But there's another Torah known as the oral Torah, or Torah she'ba'al peh, Torah that's in your mouth. The oral Torah refers to the later works of the rabbinic period. We'll talk about this. Most prominent, the Mishnah and the Gemara, jointly known as the Talmud. We're going to talk about each of these vocabulary words, that explain and expound upon the statutes recorded in the written Torah. The traditional Jewish view is that both of these Torahs were revealed at Mount Sinai, but the oral Torah was passed down as oral tradition until the destruction of the Second Temple. That's in the year 70. So we can just appreciate what's happening in the first century of the Common Era. In the early part of the Common Era, when fear of it being lost forever, that is to say, fear of the oral tradition being lost forever, led to it being committed to writing for the first time. So the discussions about how you keep the Sabbath, how you remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, or what it means to honor your parents. What does it mean to do any of the 613 enumerated mitzvot or commandments as is itemized in the Torah? How do we do them? Right? Just in the same way as it says, thou shalt not kill, and we appreciate that in our system of jurisprudence we have definitions of murder and capital murder and homicide and vehicular homicide and involuntary manslaughter and self-defense and all kinds of different categories. And if you're enlisted in the army and given a gun and pointed at the enemy, it's perfectly okay to kill somebody. If someone breaks into your home, we have all these conversations that arise out of the idea that we shouldn't wantonly take other people's lives. But there are circumstances in which it may be permissible, it may be forgivable, it may be unavoidable, what have you. Yes? Okay. The classic statement of the authority of the oral Torah is found in the first Mishnah. Now, let's just say this for a moment. We're going to give you some vocabulary words. The first word we're going to learn is Talmud. The root of Talmud is lamad or lamed, which is to teach, more accurately to learn. The other word, which makes up the Talmud, is Mishnah. That's the earliest written oral laws. Then there's the Gemara. The Gemara are the commentary or the explanation on those early laws. And then we're going to get a second category called Midrash. The root of Midrash, D-R-S-H, is to explicate, or to plumb, or to divine for meaning. We'll talk about each of those. And then there are two words that we need. Halakha, or halakhic, and agada, or sometimes with an H in the front, haggadah, or haggadik. This is legal material, and for our purposes, this is non-legal material. We'll come back to all those. Okay? So, in the Mishnah, that is in the earliest written collection of post-biblical interpretations, right? The earliest post-biblical interpretations are collected in what's called the Mishnah, which is, if you will, the kernel inside the husk of what is rabbinic literature. Does that make sense? So for instance, if a law says, we'll make this up, but we'll look at some examples. Thou shalt not kill, or perhaps it's translated, thou shalt not murder, and then the Mishnah might say something like, one should not kill someone unprovoked. Okay, that might be what it means. It may be accidents, there may be certain things happen, we're going to go in a boat together, but one person drowns, that's unfortunate, it's awful, but it wasn't intentional, or it wasn't unprovoked, right? So that's the Mishnah. It might be something terse like that, not unprovoked. Because there are cases when you can kill someone, and that's the ancient way of the world, and there it is. And then from that, unprovoked, what does unprovoked mean? Well, what if you have a grudge, or what if someone hits you, and can you hit them back, or what if, right? I mean, we then get the larger conversations, and that's what gets described in the Gemara. And we're going to look at an example of just a physical page of it. And it looks like a kernel inside the husk, and then those discussions can take place over many generations on a single page of the Talmud, right? All going back to honor your parents, all going back to prove and multiply, all going back to, right? Thou shalt not kill. Yes.
Is the Mishnah, it was written at a certain time and has not been added to since that time, is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, it's a
Subsidiary scriptures in a sense.
yes, that's right. It's layers, right? Sort of onions, or it's every generation comments on it. But the original aphorism or the original teaching remains.
And the Gemara the same?
The Gemara the same.
And what about Midrash?
Okay. Well, so let's hang on here.
Okay.
No, we're doing great. So Mishnah, the oral traditions begin to show up or begin to be collected, but not codified. Maybe by the 2nd century BCE, 2 centuries before Jesus comes on the scene. They have this oral tradition that they're passing down, but they've not yet recorded or not written down, because the fear is always that there's a tension. Once you commit something to writing, you now are stuck with it at some level, right? You put it in writing, you write it in a contract, you're too explicit. Well, then you're stuck with that. But if you can leave some room in the diplomatic language, or if you don't actually commit to writing, we do it on a handshake, well, then there's a little bit more play in the ropes, and maybe that's to the good, and maybe that's not what you want between the parties, right? So there's an inherent tension, and yet, as it becomes more and more voluminous, the oral tradition, the folk tradition, your family's stories, right? Eventually, it may become important to write them down, or to collect all those letters, or put all the photos into an album, and right, we don't want all this stuff just being loose, because eventually it will be lost. And then once it's codified, then commentaries begin to grow up around it. Right? And they become more authoritative if they begin to be collected and contained in the Talmud. But a page of Talmud, I want to have a bigger version, but I didn't. This is really small. I'll pass it around. But for your purposes, I'll pass it around. For your purposes, this middle section is the Gemara. And all of this, and then all of this, and then the outer, right, can be hundreds of years in the growing. Because the writing of this didn't take place, or the printing of this didn't take place until the 1400s when Gutenberg had the printing press. Right? And this is the Talmud was one of the very first books, the Bible also, one of the very first books that was published within the Jewish community. And the layout was such that, we'll pass this around, such that you get a physical representation of the idea that we start with this verse or this word, we have an interpretation, and then it grows around it. And eventually, it becomes difficult to distinguish and nearly impossible to read. It becomes difficult to distinguish between the biblical story and the Talmudic interpretation, or the biblical laws and the Talmudic interpretation. I'll give you the classic example of that. And it becomes all but impossible to read the text, the narrative text, absent either the Talmudic or the Midrashic insights. All right, I'll give you a classic example. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So is there one book that has them all? Or I never thought of it. Is there a book that's the Talmud?
Yes, there's a book that's the Talmud. It's a series of volumes, and the Talmud was codified at about the year 500 in the 6th century CE. Right? So it's a process that was 600-700 years in the compiling of it. But the version of the Talmud that we have is a codified version. The Talmud is the Talmud. Right? Later commentaries have continued to be written, but they're outside. They're post-Talmudic.
And then several volumes is the original.
Absolutely. So let me share this with you, please. Anything?
So who wrote the Mishnah? Were they the Levites? Were they the...
No, they're not mentioned biblically because they're all post-biblical.
Okay.
Right? Each generation has its own name. Let me show you this. Take this if you would, please. Yeah? Okay. Oops, sorry. There's a front and a back, but the front is for our purposes. Well, let's look at the back first. The back is this page, the one that looks like a flow chart. We'll call that the front. Right? The first shall be last. We're going to do another one of those reversals that are so popular around here. Okay? The evolution of Jewish law. We start with the Torah. It's not great printing. Torah shebichtav, the written law. According to tradition, the Torah was given on Sinai to Moses, was transmitted to Joshua, who transmitted to the elders, who transmitted to the prophets, and eventually was transmitted to the Sanhedrin, which is to mean the high priests and the judges. Right? And then comes from it the Mishnah. What does this mean? The Mishnah gets written. That's the earliest oral tradition. From there, we get Gemara, which is often synonymous with Talmud, which is the discussions of the Mishnah, which is a discussion of the biblical text. There were two versions. There was the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, just a geographic distinction that had to do with where these two communities were. The Jerusalem Talmud was obviously written in the land of Israel. The Babylonian Talmud was written during the exile by the waters of Babylon, where they sat and wept and dreamt of returning to the land. And then from there, we get later commentaries. We're just looking at where it breaks off from the Mishnah, and those two Gemaras. If you look on the other side of this handout, we start at the top with the Torah and the prophets and the writings. So that first rectangle, the top third of the page, that for our purposes is the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament. From that comes the Talmud, or the Mishnah and the Gemara, which comprise the Talmud. And that speaks to the question you were asking about how large is it, or how many volumes is it, as all these different categories. The entire book talks about just the explanation and definitions, the rule of exegesis. What is exegesis? Do you know that word? Yes. So there are two means, classically, of reading into or out of the biblical text. One is called eisegesis, and one is called exegesis. Eisegesis is reading into the text. Typically described as, you start with an idea, environmentalism, and you go looking for it in the text, and you find in Genesis the early chapters about being stewards of the earth and tending to the garden and the rest, and that's your perfect text. And so eisegetically, you found the text you want. Exegesis is starting with the text and reading out of it what we want it to mean, or what we believe that it means, which is what we're going to get when we get into Midrash. What's going on with this text? Why is it written that way? Why are the words written that way? When Jonathan and I do the parables class, often he'll point out what it was in the Greek. We're reading it in English, but if you can appreciate the Greek and the synonyms and the words where it appears other places, that's an exegetical reading. That's taking the text and saying, what does this word mean in its earlier or original expression? What does it mean in the Hebrew? What does it mean in the Greek? What can we derive out of this text? Right? A professor in rabbinical school, when we were learning Midrash, and remember the root is drash, he would say, what you want to do when preaching is find the verse or find the word that speaks to you and says darsheni, which is to say, explicate me or explain me. That was the idea, right? That was the idea that was more authentic than having an idea that you're going to go find. We talk about biblical proof text. You can find a text that proves what you want. I can find a proof what I want. It's just not as compelling or as authoritative way to build an argument. As if you start with a text and say, well, the original meaning of this text is, and we've lost it, but we need to understand it, right? That idea.
So it's more literal, the exegesis.
exegesis starts from the literature itself, right? So it's more literal in that way. It begins with the text as opposed to trying to find something, right? And so I don't want to pillory anyone's politics, but if you took the latest political slogan and went to find justification for it in the Bible, that would be pure eisegesis. You might not be wrong, and it might actually say be kind to animals, and who can argue with that? But if you start with the idea from outside and go to find it in the text, that's a different process. There's a gray area, right? I mean, it overlaps. But that's the idea, right? So what the rabbis wanted to do is they were exegetes, right? They were starting with the text and say, what does it mean? This is what God has told us to do. The words are very few, but they obviously have a lot of meaning, and we need a means of understanding them. And so when it says, we're back in this handout, when it suggests, here, John, when it suggests that the classic statement of the authority of the oral Torah. Remember, we're talking about how the rabbis, again, capital R rabbis, 1st, 2nd century, how the rabbis took for themselves the authority to make these interpretations, or to decide the means by which, the heuristics by which they would go about doing this. That is to say, how do we compare these two words, or how do we know what a word means? Or a word only appears once in the entire Bible. Now what do we do about how we know what it means? We can't compare it to anything else. Right? Well, the tradition might say, well, you can look at the verse before and the verse after it. And we do that all the time in the parables class. We say, well, this parable doesn't show up just in a vacuum. It helps to know what's been going on a little bit before. What's the context? And what's happening afterwards? And maybe that will help us understand it better. It may take us in a very different direction. But those are the kinds of tools we use to begin to get a handle on what this text is going to mean for us. And the rabbis in the 1st, 2nd century are defining all of those various rules such that they can derive certain rulings, authoritative rulings, such as, there's a classic one, it's called Kal v'chomer. It's a Talmudic principle that means from the, Kal v'chomer actually means from the light to the heavy, but it means from the small to the larger. If something is disallowed on Shabbat, on Friday and Saturday, then Kal v'chomer, all the more is it forbidden on Yom Kippur, which is a holier day. Right? If something is obligated of you on Sunday, well, all the more on Easter Sunday. That would be the way that the argument would go, right? Or if this pertains to a community, then all the more it pertains to the individual. Or if it pertains to the individual, all the more it pertains to the community. I mean, those are the means by which, in this system, they're deriving their way, divining is probably the best verb, right? They're divining their way through this thicket of how do we begin to organize our lives? How do we begin to take this text, whatever it means, and actually make it real for us? Please, yeah, with one, two, yeah.
How did the rabbis become the rabbis?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the rabbinic class, or this cadre or caste, in some ways, because it's dynastic, right, rises following the destruction of the temple, because with the destruction of the temple, the priesthood is basically put out of business. And those who were Levitical, someone asked about the Levites or the Levitical, those who were the priests, who were dynastically in line to bring the offering, the paschal lamb, whatever it might be, the 2 turtle doves or whatever it is, the unblemished calf, in order to offer them a pyre to make the pleasing odor to God and to do the rituals as the book of Leviticus instructs the Levites to do. Once the temple is destroyed, which I describe, I try to liken it to, do you remember how terribly unsettling it was back when we lost our innocence? I don't know how many years ago it was, when the Alfred Murrah building in Oklahoma City was bombed. And we were all like, oh my God, an American bombed a federal building. That was just so discombobulating, right? Now it's sort of it's awful, but sort of par for the course when we hear where the next act of violence was. But it was very unsettling. And I suggested that the destruction of the temple might be if all the federal courthouses or all the post offices or all of a sudden, just whatever you think of the federal government, the idea that there'd be no more federal offices around would be horrible, right? Or the chill that we thought of when 9/11 happened, if they had actually attacked the Capitol or the White House. I mean, what would that mean for our polity and how we would organize? And it was discombobulating enough and we didn't know, right, what was going on. So when the temple was destroyed, all of a sudden, essentially, the political class that had hegemony or had been organizing and running things, the priests, are out of business. In the absence of being able to any longer offer sacrifices, which is the only way that the community knew to offer thanks or to expiate sin or to do what was pleasing in the sight of God, they then turn to, there's a sort of a mini diaspora from Jerusalem where they secret out some of the greater rabbis who themselves didn't have that rabbinic authority. They were judges, essentially, to Tiberias, and there they reestablish outside of Jerusalem sort of this, I don't know what's the right word today. It's sort of not
Center of
a
learning.
center of learning, but sort of a satellite, a government in exile of sorts, you know. And what they could do in the absence of in the absence of offering sacrifices, is to double down on study and prayer and to elevate the text and what we can glean from studying it and praying it and communicating in that way with God would have to replace sacrifice. Now, you'll all appreciate this in a way that a few years ago I was teaching at St. Thomas Aquinas Academy. Aquinas Academy is up in Wexford. It's one of the Catholic diocese high schools. And there was an exchange program with rabbis and priests and Catholic schools and Jewish congregations going into each other's places. And I would teach, I don't know, a few times a year to the juniors at Aquinas Academy. And then I earned enough seniority eventually when a few of my colleagues retired that I was able to do it at Central Catholic, which was just across the street from Rhoda, which was really nice, as opposed to having to drive up to Wexford for the 8:30 a.m. class. But I was explaining this essential lesson to them, and it was explaining that the rabbis who escaped Jerusalem or decide they're going to reconstitute Judaism in the absence of the temple, treat the Torah as a love letter between God and the Jewish people. And I noticed that all these 16-year-olds are sort of staring back at me blankly. And so I say to them, I said, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't mean to pry into your personal lives at all, but have any of you ever had amorous feelings for another person? Put your thoughts on paper, put it into an envelope, put a stamp on it, sent it on its way, waited for it to arrive, then expected that in 2 or 3 or 4 days' time, maybe you get a response back, and then you get a response back from your loved one or your lover, and you read it over and over because this is the letter, this is the form of communication. Maybe it has perfume on it, maybe it's tear-stained, maybe it has a flower in it, right? And maybe it says on the back of the envelope, SWAK. And I asked the students, all 25 of these 16-year-old kids, if anyone knew what SWAK meant. And none of them knew what SWAK on the back of an envelope meant, right? Which is kind of sad. And so I explained that I had just buried a lovely congregant only a year or so before. They'd actually lived on our block, and so I got to know the couple before he passed away, and then she later, a couple years later, passed away. And she had kept 2 full shoeboxes of all the letters that he had sent while overseas. Right? And he hadn't kept all of hers, of course, but there they had this, and as a result, the family now has this whole story of how their love matured and developed, and that's essentially been lost now, because if you do by email or text or Snapchat, it's just ephemeral, and you don't have the written text anymore. You know how it is that I found myself in this relationship all these years later. How did I fall for this person? That kind of thing. But if you have a document like that, and you're able to pore over it, because that's the only means of communication you have, or that's the only missive that you hold on to, well, that's the relationship that took place. And so they're divining meaning in almost in anything and everything they can find, and find all kinds of different ways of doing that. And we're going to look at some of those examples.
I have a question.
Please.
You seem to indicate, I wasn't here last week, but
Yeah.
you seem to indicate that the priests in the temple was a hereditary
Correct.
thing. Rabbis aren't hereditary, are they?
That's correct. They're not.
I didn't think so.
They're not. I mean, it was for a long time the case. Let's just appreciate. I like to tell this because it's an important sort of touchstone. 23 years ago, the Economist magazine came out with an issue. This is like in December of 1999, as we anticipated January of 2000. That was the issue. And it was a review of what the world was like in the year 1000. Here's the year 2000. What was the world like 1,000 years ago? And they went, every page was another story. What was education like? What were economies like? What was medicine like? What was health care like? What was transportation like? What was, right? I mean, what was family life like? What was, And it turns out that just in the year 1000, we're already 500 years before that, most people were completely illiterate. Most people had never gone more than 20 miles from the place of their birth. Because why would you do that? It's dangerous, it's a long way, right? Remember a marathon, you know why a marathon's a marathon distance?
Because of the war. The messenger was.
That was actually a day's journey.
Yeah.
It was about 25, 26 miles, right? And so to go beyond that was, you were far, so the world was small and circumscribed in that way. And as a result, those who were literate, or those who did have the financial means to educate their children, which is quite a concession to send your kid to school beyond however much, right? Rather than send them into the fields or start working for the family and earning some money. But if you had the means, that tended to be dynastic, right?
Right, yeah.
But that was sort of a privileged kind of dynastic, right? And eventually it became the children that were smart enough or were showing promise enough and that were sort of funneled into that system. But rabbinic authority is not.
Sorry.
Yep. Rabbinic authority is not dynastic.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
So from 100 to 300, say, locally, how were the Jewish people led religiously?
And how did the rabbis all know all this information? When they were all together in the temple, they could pass down these oral traditions?
Yes. So the oral traditions were current or sort of, right, extant, and they were, I don't know, in the same way as you and I, we have sort of a lingua franca with Western culture and civilization, and so we sort of know these traditions. But it wouldn't be bad to go pick up Bartlett's Book of Quotations, or it wouldn't be a bad thing to go collect the wit and wisdom of Mark Twain, right, and those kinds of things. So the information was out there. As they began to collect it, or they began to codify it, there were certain persons. Judah HaNasi, Judah the Prince, is considered the editor of the early Talmud, right? And he was recognized by his peers as being the one. The story is about writing the Declaration of Independence. That Thomas Jefferson.
You knew him, right?
When I was at the rabbi at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, it's called Mr. Jefferson's University. I'm very familiar, but it was never Tom. Forgive me. When Thomas Jefferson was appointed or elected to write the Declaration of Independence, it was going to be Ben Franklin, I think the story goes, but they were afraid he'd put a joke or put some kind of pun or, he'd sneak something in. And so Judah HaNasi was selected by his peers to be the editor, right? And that's a powerful position, just like today. The head of a network or the publisher of a newspaper decides what goes in and what goes above the fold and what gets headlined and what doesn't make it in. And those are powerful, important decisions, right? All right, let me, is there more? We want to talk about more? Okay, jump in. What I wanted to point out to you at the bottom of this first page is that the bottom paragraph on the front page, the classic statement of the authority of the oral Torah is found in the first Mishnah. That is to say, they write into the Mishnah the authority they claim for themselves by way of how it is that we create the Mishnah. Right? How do I know? The Bible tells me so. And that's essentially, right, what they're doing. So if we look on the back of the page.
Man of the greatest sense.
That's right. It would pass down one generation to the next. And that's the idea. And so the conceit is that to this day, the transmission has been unerring. Right? That the version of the Torah we have is itself a faithful transmission of what was. Maybe that's so, maybe it's not. It's sort of hard to imagine that it made it all the way this way, right? But if you're going to justify any errors, as they do, as itself being part of the transmission and that having meaning in and of itself, you're doing okay, right? Once you're in that system, it's wholly consistent, but you have to take the leap into the system. The oral Torah, at the top of the second page, or the second paragraph, the oral Torah is crucial to the normative practice of Judaism today. The prescriptions for daily life found in the Bible are typically cryptic, vague, often contradictory. Some are completely indecipherable on their own, such as slaughter a red heifer, or perform the sacrifices in these ways to get these results, right? And we don't know what that means anymore. The oral law expounded great lengths on these sources, providing a vast literature that translates scriptural sources into a guide for daily living. And they give different examples. I want to share with you a couple of different examples.
So,
Please.
does the oral Torah, is it an evolving? It's not like things are written in stone.
Right.
when-
They were once, right? So that's the idea. So remember this idea?
But it comes from the Ten Commandments.
Correct. Right? And we talk about the Metonyms. We start with the Ten Commandments, metaphor, mythically. Moses goes up 40 days, 40 nights, comes down with the Ten Commandments. We're to understand that the Ten Commandments really is to say the Torah. That requires a suspension of disbelief, because the Torah describes events beyond the date on which Moses receives the Torah. Right? Moses ostensibly goes up Mount Sinai, comes down with the Torah. The Torah is a description of everything that's happened from creation up until that point, and then for another almost bounds of 40 years until Moses dies. That's the Torah. So what is it? How could Moses get a description of his own death? Or how could Moses get a description of the next 39 and a half years? Because this happens really early. Well, you have to suspend disbelief about that. And then not just the Torah. Now we're moved from the Torah to the entire Bible. Later the prophets, the writings. This also is understood to be that which Moses received. And not only that, but not just one Torah, but rather two Torahs. All of this embodied in this moment, and whispered in Moses' ear, as it were,
All the oral stuff.
all the oral stuff, including, arguably, whatever new insight we create today. Now, that new insight isn't going to be as authoritative as an insight that's been codified and collected for 2,000 years. But this too is Torah, goes the argument. Right? And that revelation, particularly, and this actually is at the end of this article, if you look at the back, very back, this is particularly true in more liberal or progressive sectors of the Jewish community. Third paragraph on the bottom. Among modern Jews, do you see where I am? Among modern Jews, religious life would be unrecognizable without the traditions recorded in the oral law. Though the various denominations still differ significantly in their views of it. Right? There's a joke that says that the Torah describes in Leviticus the laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher, essentially, by listing any number of animals that are forbidden. And then later, rabbis, commentators are going to go through those lists of animals and try to decipher what it is they have in common, such that perhaps there are certain characteristics by which we should exclude other animals. Or, the other side is, it's described, we talk about the danger of writing something down, that these are prescribed, and since these aren't mentioned, thereby they're permitted. The classic example for modern Jews today is that in keeping the laws of kosher during the week of Passover, it spells out barley, wheat, spelt, oats, right? All these different kinds of grains, lest any of them be mistaken for a grain of wheat. And wheat's not permitted. And so also spelt and barley and hops and all these other things are disallowed. But they didn't know about quinoa. And so today, quinoa is actually a very popular grain for folks who keep Passover, but like to have a little bit of starch in their diet. It doesn't say you can't, and therefore it's okay. Or Ashkenazic Jews, those Jews tend to be from Western Europe, right, basically, versus Sephardic Jews, which tend to be from Mediterranean, North Africa, just sort of as a general broad brush of these two different communities, because they grew up, and their traditions grew up in different geographic locales. Ashkenazic Jews include rice among those forbidden grains during Passover, but not so Sephardic Jews. So, during the week of Passover in Squirrel Hill, in the Chinese restaurants, you'll find that many of our Ashkenazic friends are all of a sudden Sephardic for the week. Because they don't want to give up their sushi, and they don't want to give up their Chinese food. Okay. That won't be true among the Orthodox. It will tend to be true among the more liberal folks, right, who play a little bit faster and looser. So, for Orthodox Jews, the obligations recorded in the oral law are as binding as those recorded in the written Torah. In this view, the laws articulated by the rabbis of the Talmud and those who later codified them systematically in works like the Mishnah Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, those are medieval compilations. They did, we should say a couple things. Sometimes you'll hear me refer to Maimonides. I haven't referred to him here. Maimonides in the 12th century. He was contemporaneous with Thomas Aquinas. What Aquinas did, well, I mentioned Aquinas a couple times today. What Aquinas did for Christianity, you know what he did for Christianity? Maimonides does for Judaism, which I shorthand as systematizing the body of religious thought and philosophy with Greek and Aristotelian logic, such that we can work through the system and say if-thens, for instance. If you do this, well then this is what happens. And that's how punishment follows sin, or redemption follows apology. I mean, all these different kinds of ideas. That's what Aquinas does in systematizing Christianity that way. Maimonides does much the same thing. That's what's being described in Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. But for the Orthodox, the laws about how we keep, how we observe the biblical commands are inextricably bound. So you may know that Jewish days and holidays in particular, because that's when we notice it, and Shabbat on Friday evening, and if you drive through parts of Squirrel Hill, there are certain places where it says what time sundown is, or what time candle lighting is, right? So let's first understand, we'll go do some classic Midrash. How do we know when a day begins? How do we know anything about our calendar, right? We appreciate that at some level our calendar is a fiction. The idea that today is November 30th? Yeah. The idea that today is November 30th is a convention, a fiction that we all assent to, we all agree, such that we knew when to meet here, right? The fact that we call it November 30th, 2022, is simply something we've all agreed to in order to know what we can say about when we're going to meet next, right? But it's just a made-up term for this day, based on a system that is rooted at a certain point in time that we begin to count away from. Does that make sense? In the Jewish tradition, we count from creation. And the conceit is that somewhere in the Middle Ages, the decision was made, we need a calendar. So we know when our next meeting will be. Good. Someone needs to figure out what day it is. Good. So a group was assigned to go to the Bible and to add up everything we know about length of time, reigns of kings, and ages of people that are described as such, and 40 years in the desert, and 40 days and 40 nights, and 6 days of creation, God rested on the seventh, and okay, we have a date back in history when ostensibly God said, let there be light. And that's when the Jewish calendar begins counting. And so it is that on this past Rosh Hashanah, just back in October, when we marked Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the New Year was 5,783, because based on the counting system, that's how old the world is. Now that's silly. But calendars don't have to be non-silly. They get to be functional, right? There's a date on the Muslim calendar, a date on the Hebrew calendar, a date on the Chinese calendar, all of which describes this moment, but we call them all kinds of different things, all right? So the rabbis, in deciding this, have to decide, so when does the day itself begin? When indeed does a day begin? And they determine, based on, if you open up your Bible, I don't have the Bible, and you look at the chapter 1 of the Bible, Genesis 1, and you look at the days of creation, take any of the first 6 days, and how does the description of the day conclude? Of each of those days.
There was
There
morning
was
and there was
evening
evening.
and there was morning.
There was evening and there was morning, day 1.
Right,
There was evening and there was morning, day 2.
right.
So the rabbis determined, ancient rabbis, capital R rabbis in this 1st and 2nd century, determined, well, that must mean that, if you will, a day begins in the evening. Because it says there was evening and there was morning. And so it is that Hebrew dates, Jewish calendar, start at sundown. That's the evening. Well, that's very interesting, right? Now that sounds a little bit silly, but the fact is our days start at midnight. And whether you go to bed before midnight or whether you go to bed after midnight, right? Or you did something at 1 a.m. and you described it as last night or this morning, we'll give you a little license. We understand. And if you tell me that your day doesn't begin until the alarm clock wakes you up, well, okay, so you missed the first 6, 7 hours of the day, but your day's on a 6 a.m. cycle. Okay, right? That makes sense? Then the rabbis say, well, how do we know when it's evening? What constitutes evening?
Sundown.
That's a good idea. Sundown. When is sundown? How much of the sun has to be down? Or how dark does it have to be to qualify as a point where we agree it's now past sundown? So they determine that, well, when 3 stars are visible in the sky. Okay. So now we have a little bit more information. And these are conventions, right? And they determine, well, and so how much time do we need between the time, right? We would light candles to inaugurate Shabbat. Remember, on Shabbat, they determined that you should do no work on the Sabbath. So what constitutes work? We're back to the Talmudic Midrashic question, right? What indeed constitutes work? Well, the rabbis in the Talmud define 39 different categories of what constitutes work. So maybe actually engaging in your profession for remuneration. They decide that it's spending money, it's writing, it's tearing, it's cutting, it's making music, it's kindling a fire. Well, kindling a fire. In the later days, now we have combustion engines. It's starting an engine, yes indeed. Starting an engine is considered in later years making a fire so you don't use a car. Or if you're in Israel, and we're putting together an interfaith trip for next fall, when we're in Jerusalem on Shabbat, you may find that in the hotel, one of the elevators is called a Shabbat elevator, and it's pre-programmed to just travel between every floor for the next 25 hours. So that you can get on and ride it up to the floor you need without ever actually inducing an electrical charge by pushing a button.
Hospitals here have that.
Hospitals here have that. Oh, that's good. Okay, I wasn't even aware.
I think Montefiore used to have one, but I know like at NYU,
Okay?
they have a Shabbat
A Shabbat elevator designated for that, right? Yes?
Yeah, a friend of mine, I come from New York City, a friend of mine was telling me that on the Lower East Side, when a lot of Jewish people were coming in,
Yes.
that they would get together in an apartment building and pay the rent for somebody that was non-Jewish, so
Right.
he could start the furnace,
That's right.
turn the lights on,
That's right.
et cetera.
So sometimes go to Shabbos Goy.
Yeah.
Shabbos meaning
Yeah,
Shabbat, and Goy meaning a non-Jew.
Yeah.
Someone who we're going to hire to do that on our behalf. There are other ways that works. Sometimes during Passover, the week of Passover, you're supposed to get rid of all your leavened products. Right? You go to your house, take all your breads and cereals and your pastas and all the things that have the corn syrup or anything, depending on how, the Hebrew is machmir, how stringent you want to be. You take all of those things, right? And you're supposed to divest yourself of them. Well, that could be a financially hefty thing to do, right? So the rabbis, in their Talmudic way, decide that there's a way around that. And you can, for the week, sell it to your non-Jewish neighbor, who will sell it back to you at the end of the week. So it's going to remain in your cupboards, right, or in your pantry, but you don't actually own it. Not for the week, anyway. Right? Right. So, I mean, this gives rise to all kinds of, I'll give you another joke. You like the jokes? So 3 Jews are each smoking on the Sabbath. A Reformed Jew, a Conservative Jew, and an Orthodox Jew. And smoking, lighting a fire, is not permitted, right? You can't do that. Technically, you're allowed to chain smoke. You can take something that's lit and light the next thing to the next thing to the next thing, right? So if you, which is why you can keep a fire burning or keep your oven on a low heat, or you can use the light that's on in the bathroom. You just can't turn it on, right? Or for really stringent Orthodox Jews, they don't tear things. They don't tear paper, toilet paper, so they leave it they leave it torn ahead of time, or they buy a box of toilet tissue, or right. So in order to avoid certain things, you can do the things. You just have to find a means to avoid initiating something on the Sabbath. I'll come back to the joke in a minute. During the time I was in Israel, during the Gulf War, back in, when was this, 1991, January 1991, in order to give radio announcements about when Scud missiles were coming, or put on your gas mask, or emergency broadcasts, right? If you were Orthodox, you wouldn't be watching the television, or wouldn't be listening to the radio. And so they created stations that broadcast silently, unless they needed to break into the silence with an emergency message. And so Orthodox Jews around Israel would tune in during Shabbat, during the Sabbath, to this silent radio station, in order that, if they needed the emergency message, it would come to them, but they wouldn't have to turn on the way you turn on the television to get the news. Right? So all these different kinds of, there's a whole institute in Israel that works on these various workarounds and figures out how to do these. And technology spawns them a lot, or raises these kinds of questions. Questions like, you can violate almost any commandment in order to save a life, right? Almost any commandment to save a life. But can you insert a pig's valve, a non-kosher animal's pig's valve, in your chest if it will save your life, right? Or what if it's not necessary to save your life, but it's the only means by which you do that kind of thing? So those are the kinds of questions that still come up. All right, so the question about the smoking, right, I got it. So they're all three striking up their cigarettes and smoking on Shabbat, which is completely forbidden, and so someone comes and asks them how it is that they've each made their peace with doing this. And the Reformed Jew says, well, I don't really abide by the laws, and it gives me pleasure, and Shabbat is about enjoying God's creation, and so I derive pleasure from smoking God's tobacco, and so I'm completely comfortable smoking. And the conservative Jew responds that he's simply taking the cigarette from what he lit before and lighting the next one, and so in that way he's not actually violating the Sabbath and smoking either. And the Orthodox Jew explains that, for this Shabbat I sold my lungs to my neighbor, I'm buying them back home. Right? They're not really his lungs. Right? So there's all kinds of different ways to do this. All right, now, let's make this kind of grid for our purposes. We're going to put Talmud over here, which we'll explain, Midrash over here, and we're going to put Halakha and Agada here. And so, within the Talmud, Halakha is legal material. We're going to call this non-legal material. Talmud we tend to think of as legal material, giving us laws and rules and explaining what various laws mean. But there's a lot of material in the Talmud that's descriptive of how the rabbis comported themselves. Or I'm going to give you some examples of all kinds of wonderful stories that give us insight into the rabbis, or may just be explaining something, right? But not actually solving a problem or addressing. Midrash, which we tend to think of as more fanciful, such as in the Hebrew, we can talk about this up here, in the Hebrew, the first word of the Torah is Bereshit. And Bereshit is classically translated as in the beginning. Okay? And you can hear in the word Bereshit, it starts with the letter B, or in Hebrew the letter Bet, which in the alphabet, or the Aleph Bet, is the second letter of the alphabet. And so the rabbis ask, in classic Midrashic tradition, why would the Torah begin with the second letter of the alphabet? That's one of the earliest of all the Midrashim, plural for Midrash. Why would it start with the second letter? And they do all kinds of things to describe that Bet looks like this. That's essentially a Bet. And it opens in this direction. Right? That's how Hebrew reads right to left. And so they describe all kinds of things. Fanciful explanations. Why would the Torah begin with a Bet? The second letter, not the first? Well, the first letter, which would be an Aleph, it happens to be a silent letter. It happens to suggest that creation begins here, but there's a world before that you can't know anything about. It's like when you think of your own birth or your own coming into the world, right? Your parents and your grandparents, they had lives before they knew anything about you. Hard to fathom. But there it is, and there's some things about your parents' lives, your grandparents' lives that you can't know. And that's how it is, and your learning starts from the day you show up. And there's certain things you can't know about that. Others, that the shape of the letter points to heaven and points forward, but invites us not to look back. All kinds of fanciful things that are in Midrash. But other times we get things from the Midrash that are actually legal in nature. There's a halachic Midrash. That is to say, from a given interpretation, we might actually derive a particular practice. Does that make sense? Let me just read you a couple things, and then I'm going to check on our time is short. Oh, our time is up. No, we go to 2, right? 2. Okay, good.
Yeah, you got half an hour.
Good. Okay. We're talking about Midrash, because I think it's really fun. Midrash cannot be precisely defined, only described. Midrash is a type of literature, oral or written, which stands in direct relationship to a fixed canonical text, a text that is considered to be the authoritative and revealed word of God by both the midrashist, the one who's writing the midrash, and the audience. Midrash, however, is not only a literature about literature, but rather, Midrash is primarily a religious activity. It arises out of Israel's consciousness of an inalienable solidarity with the Bible. Midrash, therefore, is the realization of the present significance of the text in our lives. And this was a great definition of Midrash. Midrash tries to find a way to bring truth which can be shared into the world. Talmud and Midrash come to do two things. Either to solve a problem, we don't know what to eat, or we don't know how to fulfill this commandment, right? What are the limits of it? There are discussions about pru-revu, which is to be fruitful and multiply early. How many children satisfy that commandment? When are you done, right? And traditions that forbid birth control or insist that, right, family planning have different answers than other traditions, which say, well, 2 children, or 3 children, or until you have a boy and a girl, or what about the couple that can't have a child, or all these kinds of come to address a problem, right? That is to say, we need an answer to this so that we know whether the chicken is kosher or not. That's sort of the classic. We bring the chicken to the rabbi. Is the chicken kosher? Do we eat dinner tonight or not, right? The other is to give us some insight and deeper understanding of the text, right? Which is why the letter begins with B, right? Partly that's simply to say that you have permission, you have license to question everything. From the origin, from the earliest letter, before we even begin to talk about what the letter means, or what the word means, or what the word in context means, or what we're supposed to do with the fact that we believe we live in a world that was created by God, or we live in a world that has a plan, or we live in a world that expects something from us. Before we even begin to tackle those larger questions, there's permission being given, simply to say, there's meaning to be derived everywhere. And that's what the rabbis, through this midrashic process, bring to the text. They assign numbers to every letter. In the same way as when you were children, you wrote code letters, and A was 1, and B was 2, and C was 3. Every Hebrew letter has a numerical value, which makes it such that every word has numerical value. And if you can find words that have the same numerical value, we can now suggest some kind of correlation or correspondence. And all of this is intended to give deeper and deeper meaning. Much like if we go back to that love letter, right? Imagine now you were exchanging love letters with an omniscient lover, right? Or someone who can quote and pun and spin on multiple levels. And now you're going back and rereading them. What did she mean? What did he mean by that, right? What's that supposed to be about? That's what's going on. A classic one. You know that there are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments
Yeah.
in the Torah?
Yeah.
What do you know about them?
One's in Deuteronomy.
That's right.
And the other one is in Exodus.
That's correct. And they vary slightly. You might think they're the same. We tend to harmonize them, right? We do that a lot, actually, when there are paradoxical texts or texts that don't quite jive. The one in Exodus gives certain information. It's largely the same as the other. You'd recognize them, and you could be forgiven if you didn't know that they were so very different. They're not so very different. The differences are things like, one says honor your mother and father, the other says honor your father and mother. What's that about? Well, the rabbis suggest, for example, classically, that suggests that your father and mother are due equal respect. Right? Okay, that seems an easy enough way to harmonize. It makes sense. We're satisfied to whatever degree with that. Someone else says, doesn't mean that at all. It's a scribal error. I mean, it is what it is. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. The author got them backwards, and we don't know which one's the first one, but, right? Well, that's one way to read the text. A more meaningful way to read the text. It may be completely correct that it was a scribal error, but if we can derive meaning from it, such that, or one of the versions says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and the other says, keep the Sabbath day. One says zachor, and one says shamor. One is remember, and one is guard, or keep. becomes, so how do you do that? Or are those not the same thing? Or are they in fact the same thing? And Marilyn, you may know that we, in the prayer L'chad Odi, the song we sing as we greet Shabbat, there's a line in there that says, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, which means Shamor, keep, and Zachor, remember, both were uttered in a single utterance. That's how God does it. Sometimes God says one thing, and yet we hear it differently. Or it says one thing, but it shows up in two different contexts, in different ways, and that's the way God does. And so it is. It says it here and here, but we're to read them as one utterance. There's no difference between these two texts. Is another way to square the circle. It's a midrashic way, right? It's a way of going back and reading into it. Another example is, just trying to give you some really classic examples. In Genesis 22, Abraham is instructed to take Isaac and go up the mountain and sacrifice him, right? And on the way up the mountain, there's a conversation that they share. And we could look at that conversation, and it's really a fun conversation, particularly if you read it through the midrashic lens. We hear questions from Isaac of Abraham, and the midrashist imagines the responses father to son. But on the way down the mountain, after the would-be sacrifice is thwarted and the ram is substituted for Isaac, there's never a conversation recorded between Abraham and Isaac again. Well, that gives rise to a midrash, or an opportunity for a midrash. And you could write it yourself, and we were going to write the sermon, that there's a conversation between father and son, and then there's this moment between them, such that their relationship changes. We know something about that in our own families, a moment when everything changed, or as a result of whatever it is that took place, and forever thereafter, the relationship was colored by what took place, and it affected whether or not they spoke again, or whether or not, right, they ever spoke of it again, or what have you. So that's an opportunity for there to be a midrash. In the next chapter, immediately after this story, we read that Sarah dies. So the midrash, it says, well, that's fascinating. That story immediately follows the other. There must be a story about why she died so suddenly. And the story, one of the midrash is that Satan shows up in some of these stories, saw what Abraham was doing with Isaac, and hurried back and told Sarah, and it broke her heart, and she dies. Right? Even though both men are going to return. I mean, these are the kinds of fanciful stories. But here's another one. This one's really fun. And this is going to speak to the rabbinic authority that we spoke of earlier. This is a classic text called the Oven of Achnai. It's... we get one more. We get one more. No, we get it.
We have extras here.
We have a couple extras? All right, so I gave them away. I need one. Jonathan needs one. Thank you. So, got it. Thanks. Oh, I did. I had many too many. I remember this. Okay. So, achnai means snakes. Like the slithery snakes. Here's the story. This is a Godic Talmud. This is from the Talmud. It's from the Talmud, but it's a Godic. That is to say, it's not explicitly legal material. But we're going to get insights into how the rabbis understood what they're doing. Here's the case. There's an oven, which one of the rabbis has, that's made with coils of clay, like snakes. Yes? So imagine you build a 5-sided oven with these coils of clay. You put them in, you make the 5 walls, so you now have this, right, entrance to this oven, which you're going to bake from underneath. But it's done with these coils, and the question is whether this dried clay oven made with these coils is susceptible to defilement. That is to say, if, for instance, you were to make a meat dish in this oven, and some of the meat juice spills over, and just like it splatters the inside of your oven, it gets into the crevices of these coils, does that render it impure for then cooking a dairy dish, for instance? Right? And in the most traditional of Jewish homes today, you might find that in the kitchen there are 2 ovens, there may be 2 sinks, there are certainly 2 sets of dishes, all kinds that they shouldn't mix. And we have a means by which, if the meat fork gets contaminated with the dairy soup bowl, then there's a means by which of purifying them. But the question under discussion is whether or not this particular oven is susceptible to defilement, or whether it's a kosher oven. And it's important, because if it's kosher, then I can come over and eat in your kitchen, but if it's not kosher, then we can't break bread together. Okay? That's the conversation. a man makes an oven out of separate coils of clay, placing one upon another, then puts sand between each of the coils, such an oven, Rabbi Eliezer declared, is not susceptible to defilement. Can you picture this? The coils are there, you sprinkle sand among all the coils, so you made something smooth. Oh, I'm sorry. That's nice, my son doesn't always call me midday. It's not susceptible to defilement. That is in its kosher, while all the other sages declared that it is susceptible and therefore unfit for use. So Rabbi Eliezer is going to bring his claim to his colleagues, right? He's going to argue on behalf of his oven. It is taught that one day Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but the sages did not accept any of them. Finally, he says to them, this is recorded in the Talmud, right? Finally, he says to them, if the halakha, if the religious law is in accordance with me, let this carob tree prove it. And sure enough, the carob tree immediately uprooted itself, moved 100 cubits, some say 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, his colleagues retorted. All right, so it's this fanciful thing, sort of this magical rabbi bringing these proofs that to buttress his argument, moves the carob tree. Again, he said, if the halakha agrees with me, if the law goes according to what I'm suggesting, let this channel of water prove it. And sure enough, the channel of water flowed backward. No proof can be brought from a channel of water, the rabbis responded. Again, Eliezer urged, if the halakha agrees with me, let the walls of the house of study prove it. Sure enough, the walls begin to tilt as if to fall. But Rabbi Joshua rebukes the walls, saying, when disciples of the wise are engaged in a halakhic dispute, what right have you to interfere? He says to the wall, ostensibly to the power behind the wall, right? Hence, in deference to Rabbi Joshua, the walls did not fall, and in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, they did not resume their upright position. They are still standing aslant. Again, Rabbi Eliezer then says to the sages, if the halakha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. And just then a divine voice cries out, why do you dispute Rabbi Eliezer, with whom the halakha always agrees? And Rabbi Joshua stood up and protested, lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. He proof texts, right? The Torah is not in heaven. We pay no attention to a divine voice. This is a rabbi rebuking God to stay out of the argument, right? We pay no attention to a divine voice because long ago at Mount Sinai you wrote in your Torah using the words of God against God. After the majority must one incline. Later, Rabbi Nathan met the prophet Elijah. Now, the prophet Elijah, we described this on Sunday morning, is ostensibly the one in history who's going to show up to herald the Messiah, and all disputes between all people, when Elijah shows up, he'll resolve them. He'll tell you, husband and wife, which one of you was really right. Political parties, Elijah will discern for you how it should have been done. That's the idea. So Elijah shows up, who at the end of time will resolve all our disputes, and they asked him, what did the Holy One Behi do at that moment? Which is to say, at the moment when we said we pay no attention to a divine voice, and Elijah laughed with joy, saying, that God replied, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. All right. So this is a very curious text. The rabbis write this text, which itself is sort of impudent and full of chutzpah and moxie and, right, gall and nerve and, right? And they record it, right? And they paint God, who they imagine, in the rabbinic imagination, as if you will, the rabbi par excellence. The rabbi who wrote, the greatest of rabbis. All the qualities you would want in a rabbi, such as God. And God wrote the Torah, but now it's in our hands to interpret it. That's a powerful statement about claiming that religious authority. Claiming that by the majority we're going to incline. That's a very practical way of getting things done. Democracy may be messy, right? And there are lots of different forms of democracy. We were all sort of raised with, I remember hearing a lecture when I was first year of rabbinical school. This was 30 years ago in Jerusalem. A political science professor from Hebrew University came down to talk to all the students in our program in Jerusalem and was describing the Israeli political system, which was different then than it is now, where they elected the prime minister directly now, as opposed to sort of the constitutional monarchy that Britain has. And he explained that at the time there were 17 different versions of democracy around the world. I don't know how many there are now, but surely there are more countries that are democratic, but also different kinds of democracy. We have the electoral college, someone else has their system, right? All kinds of different kinds of systems. We understand that it's a messy way of getting things done, but it's also a way of, I don't want to use the word democratizing things, but it's a way of making certain that more voices are heard. That's the goal of democracy in any case, right? And the rabbis are arguing that that's how we're going to get things done, because practically, it doesn't really matter anymore that whether today's Wednesday or Thursday for our meeting purposes. It doesn't really matter whether the oven is or isn't kosher. It matters that we all agree that it is or isn't kosher so that we can go about doing our things. There is, in Squirrel Hill, you may know something called the Eruv. Are you familiar with an Eruv that runs the circumference, or the perimeter, better,
Yeah.
of the community? So there are prohibitions among the 39 categories of work that the rabbis in the Talmud decide are proscribed on the Sabbath is carrying objects one from another, right? So schlepping something, bringing something. However, there's a recognition that there are certain things that we need to do. We need to carry the book or the cover dish from my house across the street to your house because we're going to have dinner together. Or I need to push my baby carriage with the kids. Or I need to have my house key. I need to have my house key. How do I come back into my home if I don't have my house key? And how do I carry my house key? So in ways of creating, so with a house key, that's not so hard. We're going to put a safety pin on it and you'll wear it. And now you're not carrying it. Now you're wearing it. Okay, good. So we got around that one, right? And we're going to agree that you're allowed to carry anything within your home. You can carry something room to room. And even within your property. You can carry something within your home out to your yard, or from your yard into your home. And then they begin to say, well, we can create a wider area, right? So it's not just 4 cubits, or 4 amot, or 4 paces, or whatever it is, but we're going to draft a ring around the community. We're going to actually put a physical wire, in this case. It doesn't have to be a fence, it doesn't have to be a border, but it has to be something that's continuous all the way around the community, such that within this area, we know that we have a protected space, and now we're free to move about and carry things. A prayer book, a prayer shawl, the cover dish over to the neighbor, right? I can take my coat off and carry it on over my shoulder. If it gets too warm, they can wear it anymore, right? Those are the kinds of things. And in point of fact, my understanding is, I believe I'm right about this, that the Eruv in Squirrel Hill extends all the way to Children's Hospital, such that, right, you could maintain your life still if you were in need of these things on a Sabbath. Okay, so I was one summer in Israel doing some youth programming, and I was dating a woman who was organizing a conclave of Jewish students from Europe. Okay, so they had a couple hundred students from Europe, from Jewish campus programs throughout Europe, coming to Israel for the week, and they were going to do this program, and I was dating one of the organizers. And so as we're in the planning meeting, anticipating the students' arrival, we were doing this on an Orthodox kibbutz, so that they had the guest houses, and they had the food, and they had the facilities for these students that were coming. But they needed, on Friday afternoon, someone to go around the perimeter of the kibbutz and confirm that the Eruv, this wire that's strung around the whole place, was unbroken. Because if it's broken, then you don't have a continuous loop, and it's no longer a place in which you can legally or safely carry without violating the law. And they were looking for someone to do it, and they said, Aaron, would you be willing to go circumnavigate the campus and make sure that... And I said, you don't want me to do that. Why not? I said, well, because I think you guys are looking for trouble. I'm going to come back and tell you that the Eruv is perfectly intact. Because if you don't know any better, you're doing fine. But here we are on Friday morning, and if it's broken, we got a big problem all weekend. I mean, so it's sort of a pro forma thing. As long as you think it's working, then it's all good. They said, okay, you're right. We don't want you doing this. If you want something else, we'll take it seriously. Right? Okay. And every week, someone goes around to the community and makes sure that the Eruv hasn't been broken. Right? Because within this area, we now have a legal means. Now, is that what... when it says in the Torah, do no work on the Sabbath, that was anticipated? Doesn't much matter, right? No, it's hard to fathom that the original author, whoever it was, God or someone else, intended that should be the workaround, any more than a Shabbos elevator stopping on every floor, right? Or any other number of things, right? You're flying transcontinentally, and so now it's time to pray 3 times a day, but you're moving through time zones, and you don't know... and you don't know where you are in terms of the prayer cycle. And so we need a ruling. Do we pray based on where we left? Or at what point on the transatlantic flight do you change your watch to the right to the destination you're going or where you've been from, right? I mean, those are Silly kinds of questions, but they mean something if you're organizing your life around it, right? So that's the Talmudic and Midrashic process. And sometimes it's very simple, and sometimes it's really complex and deep, such that we begin to make sense of what these laws mean. I should say that the law that's called lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which is clearly the way it's spelled out. In the Jewish community, it was never administered in that fashion. It was understood, and we still have this today in our insurance policies, that if you lose an eye, or you lose an arm, or you lose a tooth, well, you're entitled to a certain compensation. An arm is worth this much, and loss of vision is worth this much, and a life is worth this much, right? And if you have life insurance policy, you sort of know, you're like, yikes, I may be worth more dead than alive, right? Or Ken Feinberg, remember Ken Feinberg? He came to town, he earned his fame after 9/11. He was the one that was hired to adjudicate who should get what financial settlement. And if you were a broker at, I don't know what it was, Lazard or something on the top floor, and you were used to making 6 figures a year, and you were a janitor or a busboy at the restaurant at the top of the world, and you're making $45,000 a year, so what should your widows respectively get? Right? And Ken Feinberg, he actually came here and helped consult on the Tree of Life. Right? Who should get what? You have money's come in, and now we need to disperse it, and on what basis do we decide who's entitled to what? These are not easy questions, right? An eye for an eye indeed. Right? So all of these are means by which of either giving us greater insight into the text. What does it mean that the Torah begins with this letter, or that the word is spelled this way, or that something is curious, right? Or that it says father and mother, and over here it says mother and father. And in other cases, the Talmudic or Midrashic interpretations are intended to give us a sense of how we actually apply these laws in our own life. Yes?
So the thing about the wire, was that thought of and written down in, say, one of the Midrashs, or?
I don't think it arrives early, it's not in the Mishnah, it's not in the earliest discussions. I don't believe it's in the Gemara, which is in the Talmud itself, but in later commentaries, when they began to recognize that communities are growing at such a size, or we're now gathering in communities whereby it's no longer possible to all live in walking distance, or it's no longer possible to, the world's gotten bigger and more complex. We need to know various things, right? So it grew. Yeah, so it's more, it's either more, it's in the more Talmudic tradition, because we tend to think of Talmudic as being more legal. It's not exclusively legal anymore. The Midrash is exclusively non-legal, but it tends to be in the Talmudic realm.
Right. And in contemporary society, would it really be only Orthodox Jews who would even be thinking about that stuff?
Yes. Right. So, there are all kinds of these really sort of ugly, they're not politically correct anymore, jokes making fun of the Reformed Jew versus the Orthodox Jew. But if a Jew were moving to town today and deciding where to buy a home in Pittsburgh, if they were Orthodox, it would be important to be proximate to the Orthodox community, to the synagogues, so you could walk and participate in, right? For the conservative Jewish community, a ruling within the conservative community years ago, when I was a kid, was that, well, you're allowed to drive on the Sabbath if you're driving to synagogue. You shouldn't drive to the Monroeville Mall. But if you need to drive from Monroeville to Beth Shalom, it's important that you come to synagogue. Because there was now a recognition that just demographically, sociologically, Jews now live in Fox Chapel. And we don't have a synagogue in Fox Chapel that we do in Squirrel Hill, and so more important should you come in. The Reformed Jew doesn't even show up. They live wherever they want, and they don't even bother coming, right? So it matters in those ways, right? I'd be shocked if any member of Road of Shalom or Temple Sinai or took into account as they approached Friday evening whether or not the Eruv was intact to dictate how they spent the next 24 hours.
Right, or even knew where it was.
Or even knows it exists.
Right.
Right. Yes.
So, this study and this decisions about how to interpret the law is still going on.
Yes.
And it's going on every day in hundreds of places all over the world, right? just.
Right. Authoritative rulings come down through communities that have authoritative leadership. Does that make sense? So, I'm trying to think of something new. I mean, medical technology gives rise to all kinds of different questions, right? All kinds of things, from in vitro fertilization, to, I'm thinking of pregnancies and babies and reproduction, to organ transplants or, I don't know, cryogenics, whether we keep someone frozen rather than letting them die, in order, right? Is that permissible? Right? Well, those are contemporary ethical questions. And religious communities have means of answering those questions, or it goes through whatever system it does. There's no official system. There's no official hierarchy in Judaism. We don't have dioceses or a vertical kind of clergy hierarchy. I mean, originally I was the senior rabbi and there were associate rabbis, but we're both employed by the board of trustees, and that's about where it ends. And there's a rabbi emeritus or a senior scholar who may have some authority or credibility within that polity. But there's no rabbi that speaks for American Judaism. Now, within Orthodox communities or more traditional communities, there will be decisors, right, or authorities that speak, and they carry more weight because they're the greatest of their generation, or it's recognized that their scholarship and erudition give them the imprimatur to make these kinds of decisions, right? So yes, it's happening all the time, but it tends to funnel, right? So for generations there was literature, and actually my predecessor, Solomon Freoff and Walter Jacob at Word of Shalom, were very involved in this literature called responsa literature, which is to say that a question is asked of a leading rabbinic authority for a ruling, right? So I'll give you some examples that just immediately come to mind. In the absence of wine, can you make the sanctification blessing that you would otherwise offer over wine over any other libation on a Friday night? And the decision is yes, if you only have scotch, you can do it. If you only have Coca-Cola, and it's not your regular drink, you can do it, right? What if you don't have access to certain things, right? Or, in today's contemporary society, can a non-Jewish parent be called to the Torah at their child's bar mitzvah? The mother's Jewish, the father's not. Can the couple have? Can we invite the non-Jewish parent? Well, that never would have been conceived of a couple hundred years ago. But now it's a real question in the community.
What's the answer?
Oh, well, it varies, right? I mean, with Road of Shalom, I mean, there's not one answer that everyone follows, right? In an Orthodox community, they would say, listen, no, if you're not Jewish, you don't get called to the Torah. And if you've made your life with someone who isn't Jewish, well, that's your choice. We'll still can do a bar mitzvah for your child, right?
So it doesn't get written down somewhere and conveyed worldwide?
It does, but its authority is rooted in essentially the authority you'll grant to it. The authority you'll grant to it. When the Supreme Court makes a decision, we all learn, whoa, the new law of the land is this, or this is no longer the law of the land. Well, that's the way it is. And that goes across the whole country, and you can like it or not like it, but you're going to lump it because this is the way the ultimate judicial authority has ruled. And if you want to get out from under that, it's happened just, was it yesterday, about same-sex marriage? Well, you can pass it legislatively. But when the Supreme Court passes a decision, that goes. It's not the case in Judaism. Because there's no direct hire. We don't have a pope, we don't have a bishop for whom the decisions then trickle down. That said, in 1970, biblically, lineage passed patriarchally, right? It passed through the father, right? Such that, if you think about the line of David that leads to the Messiah, it passes through the father. And then at some point in biblical history, it became clear that sometimes, unfortunately not infrequently, rape is used as an instrument of war. And now we have a situation where Jewish women have been impregnated by marauding armies from the next community over, the Hittites or the Jebusites came over, and now we've got a problem. Now we've got Jewish women carrying babies from this other tribe, And we have a system that says the children follow the father, but these kids are going to be born into our community. And so, essentially, this is really shorthand, but the Jewish community determined, well, now it's going to pass to the mother. You always know who the mother is. And so it is that we all grew up, certainly Jews grew up, understanding that if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. That was just sort of the shorthand. But that was a major shift. Now come 1973. Now fast forward to just 50 years ago, right? In 1973, the Reformed Jewish community, the liberal branch of American Judaism, determines that demographically, we now have a situation where there is as much intermarriage where Jewish men have married non-Jewish women as have Jewish women married non-Jewish men. And in a community that prides itself on egalitarianism, how can we not allow the children born to Jewish men to be considered Jewish when we invite the children, or we understand the children born to Jewish women to be Jewish? Right? Why should Jewish men now be disenfranchised from understanding that their children are Jewish? So the Reform movement takes a position called patrilineal descent, which says, it's a little technical, but it essentially says if you're born to a Jewish mother or a Jewish father and you're raised to understand yourself to be Jewish. That's sort of the equivocation. So you have a circumcision, or you have a Hebrew school education, or you're given a Hebrew name, or you had a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah. And you were given to understand that you were Jewish. Well, then in the Reformed Jewish community, you're Jewish. To which the Orthodox community said, whoa, this is a breach with centuries. This is a wedge. You're going to now raise children who think they're Jewish. They're going to meet our children. They're going to want to get married. And they're not Jewish. And that, the Orthodox community essentially said with one voice, following the Reform movement's decision in 1973, they quickly circled the wagons and made it very clear that these Reform Jews are off the reservation. Right? So there are times when the community responds essentially with one voice and says, we're going to double down on this position. Right? But by and large, halachic precedents get established, and then they sort of become, much like I think in our own legal system, a court rules here or there, and then they build the art, and finally it reaches the Supreme Court. That kind of idea. Does that make sense?
And there's no system of disseminating
Correct.
Decisions.
No official
So
means by
it
which.
could be that the same situation arises, say, in Jerusalem and in Baltimore and in
Sydney.
Sydney, and the decisions are resolved differently.
So really,
Could be.
at the
Could
bottom
be.
of this tree, they could all end up with different authorities.
Could be. It doesn't quite change that quickly, where we get sort of three decisions in rogue directions. The decisions tend to be made, what's the right word, not diplomatically or strategically, but with all deliberate speed. Right? That was the term of art in 1954 for Brown versus Board of Education about integrating the schools. All deliberate speed. I grew up in Macon, Georgia. And I went to Central High School in Macon, Georgia, and the public high schools in Macon, Georgia were integrated in 1971. So I got to thinking when I was in high school, how was that the case, from 1971 to 1954? Well, that's 17 years. So what does that probably mean? It probably means that the local political authorities assured every mother who already held a baby in arms that your baby would not have to go to an integrated school. It had to be. Right? Some kind of accommodation was made. We're going to get all these babies through high school without having to actually sit in a classroom with a kid from another race. Right? So all deliberate speed. I only suggest it by way of saying that it's not that tomorrow decisions can be made and the community is all a splinter. Right? I mean, there are conclaves and conventions, and now with the internet, rabbis are talking with each other, and as these decisions get made, and the decisions are only as authoritative as the authority we grant. So if Rabbi Bisno makes a decision, well, that's all well and good, but no one much seems to care about decisions that I've made a ruling, Yes.
And what's the conservative synagogue or community's situation on intermarriage and
Yes.
Jewish?
So by and large, the conservative movement finds itself sort of in this middle ground, which is the middle is shrinking. But essentially, they've made it clear that while they'll welcome interfaith couples, their rabbis are not allowed to do that, to officiate at them. And so there are, on the liberal spectrum of conservative Judaism, some rabbis who really chafe at that. But they're constrained by the mores and the ethical expectations of that religious polity. But there's tensions, right? So it's not uncommon at all for Reform rabbis to meet with couples, one of whom grew up conservative and the other one grew up outside the Jewish community, who now find themselves, if they still want to locate themselves in the Jewish community, in the more liberal Reform quarter. Right? That's sort of how it shakes out. But the larger answer to your question is, again, this gets back to where we started about religious authority to make these decisions. In the Orthodox community, let me back up. There was a conservative rabbi who founded a movement in Judaism in the mid-20th century called Reconstructionism. Okay, and he was an American-born rabbi. His name was Mordechai Kaplan. And he used to speak in a very American kind of idiom about these things, much like I was using the Supreme Court as an example. And as long as we understand the three branches of government, the analogy works. And he said, he was from the conservative tradition, understood Judaism a little bit differently, but it was in that middle-of-the-road traditional space, that in Judaism, the tradition, which is, say, precedent and authority and history, deserves a vote but not a veto. Right? In the Orthodox community, it's the change happens rather slowly, by inches, right? And essentially, the tradition, precedent, authority, what got us here, has an overwhelming vote in what's allowed. So intermarriage doesn't make sense in the Orthodox community. It's outside the bounds of. Technically, an Orthodox rabbi, if they had the bedside manner that, when I hear these stories, I wish they had, essentially finds himself, and it's only to be a him, because only men are Orthodox rabbis, right? That's part of that tradition where change happens more slowly, or there are guardrails to modernity intruding. Essentially, the Orthodox rabbi has no legal standing to officiate at a wedding where only one of the two parties is Jewish, any more than a French judge in Paris can rule on a matter in the United States. They don't have standing to do that. Or an American citizen can't just bring to the court in Paris an argument about something that happened here. The French court doesn't have standing to rule on that. Right? Similarly, the Orthodox rabbi who is a legal officiant for Jews can't do anything with the non-Jewish person in that union, as it were. So it's outside their wheelhouse. The conservative rabbi says, I can't officiate your wedding, but I can certainly involve you and invite you to be part of our community, and your child can have a bar mitzvah. The Reform community says, welcome. Right? This is the reality of our world today. We're delighted that you want to make your home here, and we officiate for all couples, also gay couples, and also because that's the world, and right. So those are. But the real answer to your question is how those decisions get made. And in the Orthodox community, it's tradition and modernity. Tradition is overwhelming, and that's really where the precedent. The rabbis of the Talmud have as much say on this question of the day as does the rabbi in the room. The conservative movement has what they call a committee of law and standards, comprised of conservative rabbis who are smarter than your average conservative rabbi. Right? Okay? And they're making decisions about whether or not you can drive to the synagogue but not to the mall on the Sabbath. Whether or not organ donation is permissible, whether or not the non-Jewish parent can be involved. But that's going to be decided by those rabbis. And in the Reform community, while we have a group of rabbis who work on responsive literature, it's really suggestions. And every Reformed Jew knows that he or she alone is the ultimate decider for themselves. And ultimately, that's how decisions get made. So the Reform rabbi who believes that they're going to show up at the pulpit or show up at the congregation and tell these people what's what, is going to be in for a very rude awakening, because that's not the role of the Reform rabbi. They're not looking, the Orthodox rabbi, that is their role. The new rabbi who's going to show up at Shari Torah at the bottom of Murray Avenue has big shoes to fill, because his predecessor, Daniel Wasserman, had a big personality and led that congregation by describing and defining what was expected, and I'm going to be the rabbi and I'll be out there in front. Not so the more liberal rabbi, whose congregants themselves are more empowered and more comfortable, right? Not deferring.
Aren't
aren't there some Orthodox women now that they say, or, you know, there are a few
There are a few.
female Orthodox rabbis.
Right, and whether or not they actually have the title rabbi or rabbah or some kind of, you know, feminization of it, or whether or not they actually serve as the senior spiritual leader of a congregation, or whether they're more in education, it has more to say about whether the community is accepting of them. But yes, you're right, Marilyn, increasingly, there are a small cadre of Orthodox women who essentially are claiming their right to serve in that same role as their male counterparts.
Yeah. On a completely different subject.
Okay.
In the Middle East, in like 400 BC or 500 BC, I assume that pretty much everybody, not everybody, but most people were farmers, tending either animals or growing crops or both.
Probably.
For a long time with me, a lot of the rules like the Sabbath and you know, having 5 sets of dishes and that kind of thing don't make much sense in that kind of environment.
That's true.
Because, you know, when you have a cow, you got to milk it every day.
Right.
Regardless of what God
Yeah,
says.
yeah,
Right.
You know?
Right, a lot of
And,
this reads rather esoterically,
Yeah,
right.
right?
yeah,
And the reality is, look, I think I mentioned this when we first started, not everyone was here, that traditionally the Torah, right, which we Jews read weekly, such that we conclude the reading of those 5 books every year, and read that, that's our lectionary, for all intents and purposes. It is the case that we read that traditionally on Sabbath morning, and also on Monday and Thursday mornings over the course of the week. And so the Torah is divided up into portions, weekly sections, and if you attend a traditional community, you'll hear it read on those 3 days, such that that section is concluded in a week's time. Why on Mondays and Thursdays? The Sabbath is a Sabbath, right? But why on Mondays and Thursdays was the Torah publicly read? Because this is back in the ancient world. It's not quite the farmer agrarian world of 400 BCE,
yeah,
but let's talk about the first century or so,
Yeah.
right? That it became clear that the people weren't coming into the synagogue to hear the Torah read on Mondays and Thursdays. And so the decision was made to take the Torah public reading out into the marketplace, which would be like going to the farmer's market or sitting in front of Little Shoes when everyone's going to buy their new shoes for the school year or something, and getting right in front of people. Now, I mention that because it bespeaks a generation not unlike our own that are very distracted and aren't actually showing up to hear the rabbi preach, right?
yeah,
Because the farm was too demanding, or because their economic, domestic lives they didn't have time to sit and pray for 3 hours, right? They didn't have that luxury, or they didn't have that wherewithal. They were out making a living, or I don't know what life was like. I can tell you what it was like in the year 1000 because I read the articles. But what it was like in the year 0, I mean, it must have been awful, right? Also, if you didn't have access to the text, or you weren't literate, or you weren't, you know, I think it's a much more urban, as opposed to agrarian, or
that's what
rural,
I've felt, yeah.
community in that way, right?
Yeah.
This is a lot of sort of contemplating, not your navel per se, but
Yeah.
a lot of contrapuntal learning, right, just for the sake of continuing to immerse yourself. Some of that had to do with what they weren't allowed to be engaged in, but a lot of it was this sort of this rarefied elite, these rabbis, who were creating all of this,
Yeah.
or self-generating, much like, I don't know, you read about what kinds of studies in academia get funded by government. I'm like, really? We're spending that much money to decide whether or not the toilet paper roll should go this way or that way? I mean, you think we could spend our money on something smarter?
How cats eat.
How cats eat, right? Or what's your dog thinking about when they're shaking their leg while asleep? I mean, okay, it's interesting enough, but, you know, it's a little bit of sort of making activity for yourself, you know. So I think there's some of that going on.
I once heard this several years ago, this satirical song about the only Jewish cowboy.
Yeah,
And the only line I remember is, even out on the range, he had 2 sets of dishes.
I like that. It was a Jewish guy named Kiki Friedman, who
Yeah, I think it was,
had
yeah.
a career
Yeah.
as sort of the Jewish cowboy.
Did you watch the program called Stiesel?
Yes, yes.
Because there's so much in my head as we're talking, and I'm thinking of the school, the rabbinic school,
Right.
where the brother be a student and study in the school. So those schools, do they exist?
They do, and they're a problem because, look, we have a similar problem in that it's not the case that every student is an academic star or that every student should be encouraged to spend their life in academia, right? Some of us actually have to go out and be productive, right? We're not going to all make a living getting tenured positions as faculty. And at a certain point, some people need to be encouraged to it's time to leave school. It's time to go on and get on with your life, right? In the Orthodox world in Jerusalem in particular today, there's a huge number of Orthodox men who spend their lives being subsidized to continue studying Torah. And they're not the best and brightest, and the best and brightest go on to teach. The others are sitting in the classroom still, year after year, you know? And it's a problem, because not only are they wasting their time studying this material that isn't advancing themselves or the community, right? They're also becoming a financial drain on their families, because their wives are out making the living, and they're making lots of babies, right? These men are not bringing in anything. They also are not being taught skills that will allow them to fend for themselves in the professional world. They don't have the math skills, the language skills, the basic skills you need to get a job in an office or get a job, right?
Yeah, there was recently a series of articles in the New York Times about some of the New York schools that are getting our taxpayer money, but.
Oh, those are terrible stories.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? I mean, essentially they're infantilizing these students.
Yeah.
And it's sort of cult-like in terms of not giving them the wherewithal to stand on their own. And then you're forever dependent upon the community because you're just don't, it's like being declawed. You're just not given the skills to go out and fend for yourself. So yes, that happens. It keeps them out of military service, much like at a certain time in our history, men might have enrolled in school in order to not have to be drafted. There are all kinds of sociological things that happen in communities when people aren't prepared for the workforce, or when people aren't doing that.
So they spend their life studying, and what's the result of that in terms of an academic result? Do they come up with, do they write articles?
No, most never do. I mean, some, right, like anywhere else. It's sort of like all the kids going through college right now. Well, some are going to get PhDs, and some of those PhDs are going to get faculty positions, and some of them will win Nobel Prizes. But the majority of them, we need to get them through school and get them out to the world, because they're not going to be doing anyone any favors hanging around studying, right, or writing dribble, or they're just not up to it. No harm, no foul. Most of us.
We need electricians,
of
plumbers,
course,
et cetera.
And we need a few professors studying things, but we don't need everyone showing up at school for the rest of their life, right?
So how do these schools justify their existence?
Okay, so I'm sorry, so I was going to get to that. So it's not that they're looking for academic output, right? The way Carnegie Mellon is expecting of its new faculty, that you're going to have to produce, you're going to publish at a certain rate, you're going to have to contribute to the academia, right? At some level, the idea that you're immersing yourself in this divine word, that you're engaged in this higher value proposition, is itself its own reward. It's sort of the answer is that it's a theological answer.
A monastery, yeah.
It's like being in a monastery. It's
But it's like in Fiddler on the Roof, what he wanted to do more than anything in the world was sit and study the scriptures, the Torah.
Right, that's sort of considered the highest luxury. But for the person who's not doing it because of luxury, but they're doing it because
They don't want to get a job.
they don't want to get a job, they don't want to get drafted, they don't have any skills to do anything. This is where, I mean, it's sort of like this, I don't know, I mean, these were all your buddies are still there. You get to hang out with your college friends for the rest of your life. At some level, that's not so bad if someone will support you doing that.
I mean, but then again, some of them genuinely felt the urge to do this, that they had to dedicate their lives to.
Well, because it's been held as the highest value, and it wins government subsidies for your community. And I mean, they're perverse incentives, right? But if you're never encouraged to go out and stand on your own, if you're never given to understand, and I'm starting to tell my kids that, look, we're happy to pay for you to go to college, but we expect something beyond that, which is that you'll stand on your own. I mean, at a certain point. But if you never give your kids that expectation, well, why shouldn't they continue to believe that, So it's a problem.
But
It's a
the
problem.
schools are subsidized?
The schools are subsidized. Right. Right. There was a Faustian bargain made in the founding of the State of Israel by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, that in order to win the political support of the then small Orthodox community, assurances were given that as long as they were studying Torah, which is to say, as long as they were working at reconstituting the great yeshivas of Europe, here in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and as we try to rebuild after the Holocaust, then they will be given protections from being drafted into the army, and certain political concessions will be granted to the community. Never imagining that would create the societal drain on the system, or that the community would grow as fast and as prodigiously as it has, such that the state of Israel finds itself in a real problem. Much like some of our larger municipalities in the country have pension problems. Well, promises were made a century ago, or a decade ago, decades ago, generation ago, and now we just never imagined that. It sounded good to give policemen a pension after 25 years, but now we got 45-year-old guys retiring at full pension, and then going back and working again. Well, yikes! We just never conceived of that. A pension was supposed to allow you to retire, not to double dip and draw two salaries. So Israel has these same kind of problems. They've just got the theology baked into it as well. All right.
Thank you.
All right. So a little bit of oral Torah.
Thanks very much.
Clear next time. Thanks, everyone.